So I'm sure you see me looking down. I've got notes here, I've got notes here, I've got the Bible here, trying to make these lectures a little bit more conversational in a one-way format. I get that, but trying to think about ways to present this conversation as an engaging, inviting thing. But I noticed that when I look at my notes, I spent a little bit too much time because I got excited talking about mercy, got excited talking about ethics and spirituality. I won't spend as much time on this lecture. This one I intend to be a little bit shorter. So the lifting up and putting down, when we look at this language, and I can point you to verses really 49 through 52, we see in verse 49 that the writer refers to God as the mighty one. Mary refers to his strong right arm in verse 51. These are kind of warrior titles. It's warrior language. So in some ways, Mary is setting us up to think about God's going to war on behalf of his people. Now that's not language that maybe we really like sometimes, but it is language that is reminiscent of the Old Testament. There is that Yahweh as warrior kind of motif that we find in the Old Testament. And then we find that in verse 51, the work of God is referred to as his mighty deeds. In verse 51, it says he's scattering, or he has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. So those that would lift themselves up against God, God says, you're going to be pride, or you're going to be proudful. I will deal with that. In verse 52, brings down rulers and exalts the humble. Well, this takes me right back to the book of Exodus, as you have that clash, right, between Israel and, in a sense, Israel's God, and the Egyptians and their gods. And that clash, we know, results in the Exodus from Egypt, as these people who were slaves are freed. So there's the Exodus kind of event in the background, but I think there's also the Daniel event. So if you're familiar with the Old Testament, with the book of Daniel, Daniel is an advisor to the Babylonian king, and Daniel makes it very clear, this idea that if there's a king raised up, it's because God raised them up. If there's a king deposed, it's because God deposes them. So it sets up this idea that God is involved in this, in the political wranglings of the day. Now, I don't know what you think about that, but it is certainly a perspective that the Bible brings, and I think some would see God's involvement, would see a heavier hand, and some would see a lighter hand, and we can have a conversation about that. But whatever the case, it seems that in the Magnificat, Mary envisions the returns, maybe you shouldn't say envisions, Mary returns to the idea of God as a military champion on the part of his people. And then, by virtue of that, turning unrighteous political arrangements on their ear. That's another dimension that I see in the Magnificat. We'll come back in a moment, and we'll talk about a little bit more about dignity and respect.